An honor and delight to be here with Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who is the senior rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Los Angeles. Also teaches at American Jewish University as Ziegler, and has written a number of books. And very good books. Has 3 children, has been married for some time, and does a lot more than that as well. Speaks around the country. So thanks for taking time to talk.
Nice to be with you.
So what gives you any sense of assurance of the survival of the Jewish people?
A simple question. Assurance, no, but a good deal of faith. There was a wonderful historian taught at Brandeis University by the name of Simon Davidovich, who wrote a very classic essay called The Ever-Dying People. And he pointed out that in every generation of the Jewish existence, that generation always worried that it was the last. And he pointed out that the ever-dying people is also an ever-renewing people, that there is a deep well of cultural resilience and spiritual creativity and courage within the Jewish people that gives us the capacity, generation to generation and era to era, to reinvent ourselves, to reimagine the institutions of the Jewish people, to reinterpret the values of the Jewish people, to reshape a sense of the Jewish project in the world. And that because of that deep cultural resilience and that wonderful spiritual creativity, we have been able to become a new people, an ever-renewing people. Now, in 1964, the second most important news magazine in the country, which was called Look magazine, published a cover article called The Vanishing American Jew. And the author of the book of the article had gathered all the demographics of the Jewish community to date and said, we have now entered the 3rd generation of Jewish settlement since the immigration from Eastern Europe. And American ethnic groups disappear after 3 generations. And the American Jewish community, he said in 1964, will wane significantly by 1980 and be completely gone by the turn of the century. And the interesting thing is that Look magazine is gone and we're still here. And the reason is because we evaded the law of sociology because of this deep well of creativity and resilience that's within us. So what you're going to see is significant change. The synagogue of tomorrow will not be like the synagogue of our grandparents. The Jewish school of tomorrow will not be like the school of our grandparents. There will be new institutions that come and offer an opportunity for people and families to engage with Jewish life. But the Torah that we teach will be the same as our grandparents because that Torah is eternal. And that's when I see that the course of Jewish history and see how that plays out over the course of Jewish history, I have every confidence that it'll play out in our generation.
Beautiful. You know, we often talk about the trauma that is there, but we don't talk as much about this resilience, which is both.
And I think that's a problem, because if you only say to your kids, we are a crisis-driven people, if you only raise your hands in the air and say, I'm pessimistic and there's no hope, there is no reason for a young person to want to sign on. Nobody wants to be on a sinking ship.
Right.
But if we say we have something so precious, so valuable, so ennobling, so uplifting, that it has carried us through the generations, then kids, young people will want to say, this is something I want a part of.
So I heard you say 2 of the 3 big pieces, but not the 3rd. One is Torah Yisrael, that within the eternal Torah. One is Klal Yisrael, that we are resilient people. But I didn't hear you say the 3rd, which is Medinat Yisrael. What is the relationship of the state to our...
That's a very good question, and we could spend the evening. First, let's realize something. We gave up sovereignty over Israel, over our land in the year 70 when the Romans smashed the temple, and then again in the year 120 when the Bar Kokhba revolt destroyed us. And we left the land. There were pockets of Jewish settlement, of course, all through that. But we had no sovereignty. Even in 70 we had no sovereignty. In fact, the last war a Jewish army won was 166 BCE when the Maccabees beat Antiochus We went from 166 BCE till 1948. That's a longer losing streak than the Cubs. We're not practiced at sovereignty.
From Chicago.
Yes, well, I'm sorry. We are not practiced at the art of sovereignty. We're not good at it yet. It took us a long time to learn how to survive diaspora. It's going to take us a while to work out what it means to be Jewish and sovereign, what a Jewish democratic sovereign state looks like, what its ethics are. And on top of that, of course, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, God, played a very funny joke on us. I always say to my people in the congregation, don't ever go to Hawaii, because you'll do what I did. You'll stand on Maui Mountain, you'll see the beautiful blue sea and the beautiful sandy beaches, and you'll turn your eyes toward heaven and you'll say, Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the world, you knew about this place and you put us where?
Yeah, right.
God put us in the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. It's been the most dangerous neighborhood in the world since we arrived, since Avram Avinu arrived, since Abraham. But today in particular, when you're in the midst of an upheaval between Shiites and Sunnis, an upheaval that's brought on by the Arab Spring, a clash between Russia, Iran, and the United States and the Saudis, we are in the middle of a crucible. And we're trying to live decent, moral, democratic lives in the middle of that crucible. Staying alive is an achievement in that neighborhood. Staying alive and not losing your neshama, not losing your moral sensibility, is a miracle. Yeah. It's going to take some time, and we're going to fail in certain places, and we certainly have. But you've got to understand that we're trying to do something unprecedented, not only in our own history, but in the history of Western civilization, to create a moral civilization in the midst of this crucible of upheaval and turmoil. So there too, I'm very hopeful, because when I read Haaretz and I read the Jerusalem Post, I read a deeply moral people struggling to keep its soul. And that's what makes me glad.
So coming back to our side of the ocean, you talked about what makes you optimistic about our survival and thriving.
I may be the only one, by the way, right? I've read the demographics. I may be the only one.
So what would your counter argument to yourself be? What's your source of pessimism that you think actually challenges that narrative of resilience?
Rabbi Shmuly, there is no shortage of pessimism in the Jewish world.
Right.
We are such a professionally pessimistic people. The great Abba Ibn once said the Jews, the only people in the world, refuse to take yes for an answer. Every silver lining has to have a cloud. The great Jewish telegram was, start worrying, details will follow. Of course, look, you have assimilation, intermarriage, disaffection, disaffiliation. You have the acculturation of Jews into an America. There's plenty to be pessimistic about. Yeah. And yet, I look at the lives that my great-grandparents lived when they left Europe. They didn't leave Europe because they wanted America for its baseball and apple pie. They left Europe because they were being chased out. Mm-hmm. My children live lives of political security, but spiritual insecurity. My grandparents had it the other way around. I think we can survive in a condition of freedom and stability and liberty. I think we can make a life in that. I really do think so. So yes, plenty of pessimism to be had, but I refuse to speak that narrative, because that narrative suppresses the creativity of this people. The Hasidic tradition rested on a foundational idea that atzevut, that sadness, blocks your access to God. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest to you that the crisis narrative that our community is so addicted to blocks the cultural resilience and spiritual creativity that we're going to need to survive. Mm-hmm.
Mm. So turning to your own movement, which you've affiliated with for your rabbinate, the conservative movement, how do you understand that movement's relationship to halakha today? We've seen the orthodoxy drift to the right. This is an overgeneralization, and general conservative movement drift to the left in many ways. And I wonder if you've seen a change in your decades in the rabbinate of that relationship to how law evolves in American society.
Look, there's a bigger question that has the movements, orthodoxy, conservative reform, and then Reconstructionist renewal and others. these movements came from Germany in the 1870s and 1880s. They were imported to America with the immigration of the 1880s and 1890s. They were transplanted here, and they have survived largely institutionally. There's nothing else in the world that's that old. I mean, the technology that we're speaking on today is only 20 years old, not even that, 10 years old. Why do we think that these movements aren't going to continue to evolve? These movements are going to evolve. Their ideologies are going to evolve. Their institutions are going to evolve. Their approaches are going to evolve. And evolution is a tough thing, because it presents you with a problem. The stuff that you're used to, you have to let go of. What got you here won't get you there. Right. And it takes a great deal of courage to say, this has been useful in past generations, but what our future is going to need is something different. I think that the conservative movement, like the Reform, like the Orthodox, like Reconstructionists and Renewal, they're all evolving. I'm not afraid of that evolution. Right? It's going to mean institutions are going to change. They're going to change their branding. They're going to change their ideologies. They're going to evolve into new shapes and new forms. That's good. That's a really good thing. I was raised by a set of institutions associated with the conservative movement. I received a wonderful education from those institutions and a wonderful background. Camp Ramah, the JTS, the University of Judaism, now the AJU, and the Weiss in Yerushalayim, the Solomon Schechter Day School Association. These are wonderful institutions, but they're going to change. They have to change. If it's not changing, it's not living. So the conservative movement established itself on the basis of an ideology, this idea of historical Judaism, the development of Judaism, and at the same time, it established itself as a halachic movement. The problem that conservative Judaism had from the very beginning was that its ideology was an academic ideology, not a devotional ideology. It made for wonderful schools, because it gave you an approach to the texts and the ideas of the Jewish people. You could see them evolving over time. But it didn't answer the question, how should I live my life? What do I grasp as the sacred? How do I come close to God? How do I bring God and a godly way of life into my own home, into my own being? That devotional ideology, Jews had to go outside the conservative movement to find. And now what we're doing is we're trying to reconcile that. We're trying to bring that devotional ideology to the core of the way we celebrate Jewish life. And there's a number of experiments all across the country where this is happening. And again, I'm an optimist. I may be the only optimist in the Jewish world, but here he is. I'm an optimist because I see this experimentation going on with such earnestness and such passion. And I think there's going to be an evolution, right? We may end up changing the name. We may end up amalgamating with another movement. We may end up breaking it up altogether. Well, I don't know where it's going to go.
So just to circle back, how do you understand the relationship to halakha today? What do you see happening within that movement as it is today?
Well, again, the idea was halakha. There's a way of living that's governed by halakha, and that halakha was developed by, in recognition of the fact that halakha has always been evolving, right? The problem that the conservative movement had is that was the rabbi's ideology. The community didn't keep to that halakha, right? So in my particular synagogue, I meet halakha because in the synagogue itself, people expect us to do things right. And I try very hard to offer halachic forms to people in their own lives. So on the one hand, we're trying to teach people certain ritual ways of doing things. In our shul, we pass out Shabbos candles on Friday afternoon. And it's a wonderful thing to stand at the door of the nursery school and pass out Shabbos candles. And a woman says to me, some of them say, Rabbi, I already light candles. And others of them say, I've never done that. Teach me to do it. And others say, that's for my mother to do. And then she looks at the baby carriage in front of her and says, I guess I'm a mother. It's my turn to do that now. We're trying to teach people. We don't have a coercive power of halakha. We have a persuasive power of halakha. And we're trying to teach people what a halacha of Shabbat, what a halacha of kashrus, what a halacha of tzedakah, what a halacha of chesed looks like. And this is what we're trying to do. This is what conservative movement is always trying to do.
Okay, so I think my last question, but don't hold me to that. You served for many years with Rabbi Harold Weiss. and also wrote your dissertation, your doctoral dissertation recently on his biography, which is a book coming out soon. We should look for. Who's the publisher?
I don't know yet.
Okay, but
it'll be a movie soon.
It'll be a movie. So can you tell us? I mean, you wrote a book on the man, but maybe you can share a story with us that kind of encapsulates who this figure was.
Harold?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, there's a whole story, but who was this person in essence?
Yes. Well, I'll give you just one story. There's many, of course. Rabbi Weiss graduated JTS in 1950, and in 1952, he became a rabbi in Beth Abraham congregation in Oakland, California. He was a troublemaker. He was a revolutionary, and the leaders of the conservative movement wanted to get rid of him, so they sent him to the West Coast, where he couldn't affect anybody. Little did they know that the Bay Area would become ground zero for the great cultural revolutions. So Harold was there on the spot when the great free speech movement at Berkeley broke out and the counterculture of San Francisco. His kids came to him and said, Dad, the hippies of Haight-Ashbury, they're all Jewish. So he went down there and started meeting the kids who were hanging out the culture of love in 1967 on Haight-Ashbury and realized there are lots of Jews. So he went back to the sisterhood of his shul and asked them to cook a Seder. And in 1967, he borrowed the basement of the municipal community church and ran a Seder. They put up flyers all over the neighborhood. And they figured 20, 30 kids would come. 200 kids came. Wow. In bangles and beads and bell-bottoms and with drums. And Shul Weiss got up on a table and he led them in a freedom Seder, in a liberation Seder, because he realized that these kids who had rebelled against their bourgeois parents were doing it for good Jewish reasons. They wanted ideology. They wanted a sense of mission. They wanted the freedom to imagine a different kind of world. What better way to celebrate Pesach?
Beautiful.
So Harold ran the first Love-In Seder in 1967.
Okay, so here's actually my last question. What is a piece of Torah that has animated your rabbinate? What do you feel like at the end of the day this is about for you?
Piece of Torah that's animated my rabbinate?
Yeah, not even the piece, just sort of the approach that you feel.
Abraham Heschel.
Yeah.
Abraham Heschel is one of my great heroes. Once made a very beautiful observation. He says the second commandment of the 10 Commandments says you're not allowed to make an image of God. He says, but look what the Torah says. There is an image of God walking the world. How do you reconcile those two? He says God creates the human being in the divine image. So how do you reconcile those two teachings? And he said it's very simple. What the Torah teaches, you're not permitted to take anything of the world and make it into an image of God except one thing. There's only one thing that you can make into an image of God, and that's the entirety of a human life. Entirety of a human life has to reflect our image, our notion of who God is and what God demands of us. And that's what we rabbis are here to teach. Right. And if you're able to bring, what Rabbi Weiss used to call it a godly life. He wanted God to be a verb and an adverb. Right. He said, don't ask me if I believe in a God who is somehow metaphysically above. Ask me how to live a godly life, how to approach the next human being I meet with a sense of the utter infinite preciousness of that human being. The work you're doing on the border. How do you bring people who are seeking freedom and liberty and safety into our community and embrace them and do it and recognize their humanity? They're not other. They're part of us, and their suffering hurts us. How do you live a godly life? That's the great question.
Beautiful. So in some ways that circles back to my source of optimism, because I believe that idea is so fundamental and crucial to the future of humanity that I can't imagine it not surviving. And if our job is to be ambassadors and messengers for that, then we have to ensure our survival to ensure that message continues to live.
But there's one more point to that, and that is, and this is why it's based in faith. This is why it's rooted in our history. This is why we daven and not just practice, because it's so easy, and you know this, it's so easy when you confront the evil of the world to give up and to say, it's too much for me, it's too much out there. And what Rabbi Weiss taught me is that the purpose of faith is to recharge, renew, re-engage. You never ask God, Rabbeinu Shalom, fix the world for me. Yeah. You say, Rabbi Shalom, give me the strength to go back out there
That's right.
and love deeper and fix what is broken and teach more passionately and give more generously. Rabbi Shalom, give me the means. I will make the ends happen.
Beautiful. You should continue to have all the chizuk and all your avodat kodesh.
Thank you.